Hello and welcome to the I3 lecture series hosted by the Masters in Digital Photography program at the School of Visual Arts. We are thrilled to welcome a fine artist, Richard Tuschman, as tonight's guest speaker. Oh, behind me. Originally trained as a painter and printmaker, Richard began to experiment with digital imaging in the early 1990s, developing a signature style that combined his interests in graphic design, photography, painting, and assemblage. This digital work found a wide audience commercially, and his work graces the pages of magazines, annual reports, book jackets, and catalogs. Clients include Adobe Systems, the New York Times, Penguin, Sony Music, Newsweek, and Random House. Among others, his work has been recognized by American Photography, Print, Photo District News, American Illustration, and Prix de la Photographie Paris. His latest exhibition, Once Upon a Time in Kazimierz, is currently on view at the Klumpchen Gallery, so don't miss out. It's a beautiful show, and it's up for another week or so?
Yeah, till April.
April 9th. So please help me welcome Richard Tuschman to our lecture series.
Thank you, Jaime. Thank you all for coming. I'm having a show. Okay, so what I do in my fine art is that I create these fictional narratives in the form of staged painterly photographs. Okay? And I suppose what I've sort of become known for, what the kind of the catch is that the sets in these images I make as miniature dioramas first, and then I photograph the people later and combine them in Photoshop. And so I've now created two bodies of work using this technique. This is the most recent body called Once Upon a Time in Kazimierz, which I describe as an open-ended novella, told in photographs. And the first body of work was titled Hopper Meditations, which was a personal photographic response to the paintings of Edward Hopper. So this is a diorama from Hopper Meditations, and this is an image, using that diorama. So probably the most frequent question I get, or certainly one of the most frequent questions I get, is, why? Why do you go to all that trouble? Why not, just, find a location, get the models there, make the photograph like a normal person, a lot of times I'll, have jokingly say, well, I don't know, I guess I'm just a glutton for punishment, but on a small scale. When it's partly true, but the longer answer is that, this technique, is rather convoluted technique, is something that really has evolved over many, many years. And it's really kind of an adaptation that sort of brings together, all the various skill sets that I've acquired over the years, and it kind of plays to my own temperament and the way I see the world. So I think to really kind of figure out how I arrived here, we kind of have to really go back to the beginning. And I can actually remember, even as a small child when I was, 6, 7, 8, 9 years old, underneath my bed I had this box. It was a little bit bigger than a shoebox. And in the box I had all these little objects and trinkets that, for whatever reason, were very important to me. And they were like, souvenirs, maybe toy soldiers, foreign coins that my grandparents might have bought me. And I really loved just kind of going through this box and, holding each object and kind of contemplating, what it meant to me. And I can even remember, sitting in school, like on rainy afternoons, just kind of looking forward to going home and having these kind of objects to hold. And, this that had some emotional resonance for me. And they provided some comfort, to me. And that kind of tactile, comfort, you can actually hold something in your hand, I guess has always kind of stayed with me. I also want you to, this is here I am as a puppy. I really started making dioramas about 30 years ago. When I arrived in New York after art school, As Jaime mentioned, I think I studied painting and printmaking in art school. But when I arrived in New York in the early 80s, I had a small space, and to make a living, I worked in an architectural design, an architectural supply store. And I found myself really drawn to the model building materials in this store. And I began making these box constructions out of balsa wood. And I painted them with this wax paint, called, what's that called?
Encaustic.
Thank you, encaustic. Where you have to work with the paint, the wax, while it's hot, and as it cools, it dries. And it gives you a lot of possibilities for textures and different kinds of surface finishes. And I love that you could kind of make these sort of old-looking textures. And a lot of people have remarked that these boxes, and there's actually a little scene inside that you can see that I made these little chairs and tables and things. And a lot of people have remarked that these look a little bit like old cameras. And until this time, I really had somewhat of an ambivalent relationship with photography. I really always loved photographic images. But I didn't have great experiences in the darkroom. I found it really frustrating. And so I always incorporated photography more in terms of collage or photo printmaking, or here, making things that looked like cameras, I guess. I was also doing a lot of painting at the time. I like to paint in oils. I've always been inspired by art history. So I was drawn to sort of these older techniques and these with glazing and painting layers on layers and layers. And I liked oil painting because it was really slow, and I tend to be pretty slow. I do things pretty slowly. And I liked just reworking things, going back into them. And so I would kind of start with a very, very loose idea in mind, and kind of let the painting kind of take me wherever it would. Okay, and then eventually I discovered Photoshop. And by around 1990, I had left the architectural supply store and moved on to a job doing graphic design for the cable station HBO. And they were really, the guy who ran the department was pretty forward thinking, and he got Macs, right as soon as they came out. And so I began learning all the software. PageMaker was the original thing, then Adobe Illustrator. And then in 1990, Photoshop was introduced. And I kind of dove into it right away. And for me, Photoshop was much more intuitive than the darkroom. And it was much more like painting and printmaking for me. And so right away, I started kind of putting together a portfolio in Photoshop that really kind of combined what I had been doing, in the analog fine art world with things that I had been learning in the commercial world. And before I knew it, I had become this sort of a freelance photo illustrator. And I started, I left HBO, and for, the past 20-odd years, I've been making these photo illustrations, freelance. This was probably the first really, really big assignment that I had. This was, I think, in 1994. It was the splash screen and packaging image for the first version of Photoshop with layers. Version 3, right, 3.0, yeah. And the 90s was a great time to be a Photoshop illustrator because it was very much in demand, and the internet hadn't happened yet. So there were still big budgets for photographers and illustrators. And for 5 or 6 or 7 years, I had more work than I could possibly do. So I was constantly turning down work. The interesting thing was that the more I got into Photoshop, the more it kind of led me back into photography. And so I wanted to become a better photographer. And especially I wanted to start photographing people because I wanted to have a wider range. And I especially wanted to be able to do book covers. And so I started photographing more people. This was actually an outtake for a book cover, but I really like this image better than the one for the book cover. And you can see I'm still very much into the retro thing. I can't seem to get quite past the mid-century, the 20th century, but I'm getting there. And eventually, I began combining, the photographing the people with the dioramas. They came back into my life in a way. And this was an illustration for a magazine about, the theme was returning veterans and how the difficulties they have reintegrating with their families. So I found that I could actually, kind of blend these things. That Photoshop allowed me to blend these different scales kind of seamlessly. And this opened up a lot of possibilities for me. And this was around 2007 or 8, I think. And by this time, I found myself I really wanted to get back into fine art. And I had really been away from it for quite a while. And one thing that I learned was that if I wanted to be taken seriously as a fine artist, was that I had to have a consistent body of work that really came from within me and would be a number of images that held together as a series. And so I hit upon the idea of kind of reinterpreting, Edward Hopper paintings photographically. It just seemed like the sets would be simple enough that I could build them, and I knew that I could, kind of convincingly photograph the people and blend them into the scene. And so this was the first one that I did, the Hopper Meditations. And I always played the males in them because I don't have to pay myself. And I don't really smoke. No cigarettes were actually smoked. It was done in Photoshop. And the first, I think there are about 17 in this series. I'm not going to show all of them tonight because I want to talk more about the new work, of course. But the first several that I did were actually based on Hopper paintings. And I tried, to keep fairly close, to the content of the painting. This one is probably maybe his most famous painting, Morning Sun. Oops. And then as I got more into the series, I felt freer to kind of make my own compositions that were more just inspired, by his work. So this one is called Pink Bedroom, and this is the same diorama that I showed earlier in the lecture. I did about 4 or 5 different images using that same diorama, and especially I could turn it around and shoot it from different points of view and get a little more mileage out of it. Because the dioramas they're pretty time consuming to make, so I try to get as much mileage out of them as I can. And again, I play the male. And I still like doing book covers when I can. And this one was adapted into a book cover. This was done about a year ago, I think. And unfortunately, they wanted to use the same model, but she was overseas. So, and as it turned out, it worked out okay because the character that they wanted to illustrate had dark hair anyway. So all I had to do was repose the model. I didn't have to even rephotograph the diorama. And I took off. It was a present day novel. So they didn't want the guy wearing the vest. So I was able to just take off the vest in Photoshop. So, and it made this nice book cover. So while I was working on Hopper, I went to visit Poland with my wife, Eva, who grew up there. And that's actually her in the lower left, looking up. I was really struck by the beauty of the architecture. And I was still in the middle of the Hopper series when I visited, but I always like to kind of have one project in the back of my head while I'm working on, I'd like to have the next project, I say, in the back of my head. So I don't end up in this kind of, no man's land with not knowing, knowing what am I going to do next, And I find that usually if I just stay open to it, something will come to me, So, knock on wood, I'm kind of lucky. I haven't really been hit, at least, and I'm gonna, I'm not that young, really ever with the block, So, and I knew that I wanted to do something with the architecture that I saw in Poland. Now this is the first one. This is the old city, which has been beautifully renovated. But I also liked the parts that had not been renovated, and just kind of the gritty sense of history that these places had, the graffiti, and just the way time had sort of worn away at these old buildings. And these are the buildings that I kind of would use as reference and as models, for the project that I have just completed, Once Upon a Time in Kazimierz. Now, this particular building actually is not in Krakow. Kazimierz, by the way, is the historically Jewish neighborhood in Krakow. And the project that I decided to do, I wanted it to be I wanted to really tell more of a story than the Hoppers. The Hoppers, I really enjoyed working on the Hoppers. But all of the images were kind of isolated, and they didn't really connect other than stylistically. And so for this project, I wanted to really have an overarching narrative that would, at least suggest that they were all part of a story. And the more that I got into it, the more I actually thought of a more and more, kind of solid story in my head. But I really still like to think of it as open-ended, and I really like to encourage, every viewer to make their own interpretations. So I love this old building. This was actually in a town in the south of Poland, where my wife's parents grew up. And I loved this building, and then the next time I went back, they completely renovated it, and it was all painted shiny new, and I was really disappointing. And this is actually in the neighborhood of Kazimierz in Krakow. And now, like the rest of the old city, it's all renovated, and it's filled with shops and cafes, and it's very, it's bustling. But I wanted to do something that took place in an older time. I guess I've always been drawn to tragedy more so than anything else. And I've also been I have this strong connection with my family history. This is my great-great-grandfather. And that's actually not my grandmother. It would be, I suppose, my step-great-great-grandmother. He had the story goes he had a number of wives, And she was, I think, the last one, and she was much younger than he was. So I wanted to do something that kind of maybe paid a little bit of homage, to my origins, and also to my wife's origins. So I came up with this idea to make this sort of novella, about this family in Krakow that lived in the Jewish section in, say, around 1930. And I wanted to place it around 1930 because, first of all, it's not too far back, and so that I actually have some connection with that time. And I didn't want to have, I wanted to have it sort of maybe in the shadow, the shadow of the Holocaust, but I didn't want to place it, directly in the Holocaust, because I felt that was just really beyond me, to actually deal with that. So I didn't want to actually have, soldiers or Nazis in it, but I wanted there to be kind of a foreboding darkness maybe present in the photographs. So that was my idea, to start. So when I, start a project, or even when I'm, when I tell students, who are about to start a project, how to begin, what I like to do and suggest is that as much as possible, you really immerse yourself, in the subject. You kind of want to get to the point where you're sort of living and breathing whatever it is that you're trying to tackle. And what I find is that way is that even when you're not consciously thinking about it, the gears are still turning, in your unconscious, and that's when you come up with these ideas, sort of quote unquote in the shower, or wherever when you're taking a walk, and then suddenly these ideas come up. So the first thing that I do for a new project, or this one, is I just start gathering reference. What I like to do is make use of the digital tools that I have. So I just, create a folder on my hard drive and just start throwing images into it. I create a number of folders, actually. This one was for architectural reference, you can see. Then I'll create another one for hair and wardrobe reference, doing research about that. And this is all really fun for me, looking at this stuff up. And it's, of course, very, very easy to do now. You don't have to leave the house to do it. And these I use, I just use the browser, Adobe's, Bridge. And that's what I use to browse through all these and open them up in Photoshop. And I also create a folder of reference just for composition, mood, and color, okay? And these might be any images that catch my eye, while I'm working on this project and that I might want to, steal something from. And I don't really worry too much about stealing because I know it's always going to kind of be filtered by my own, sensibility. And I don't mind paying homage to somebody. I'm very comfortable with that. And so you can see a lot of the images are art history images or vintage photography images. Some of them are contemporary photography images. And I try to always keep my eyes open for anything that just catches my attention. And I try to either take a screen grab or save it, in a folder and keep it handy. I also make sure that I have these things usually on like my mobile stuff, my iPad or my phone, so that when I'm on the subway or anywhere out, I can, and I have a free minute, I just go look through it, and it keeps my mind kind of turning. And I also make sure that I have a notebook that I can write down ideas in. I find it, to be really handy. So then when I'm feel really saturated and I'm ready to really start on the project, that's when I'll start actually building the dioramas. And so I have my visual reference, on the top, and then I'll actually draw the plans for, in this case, for the building in Adobe Illustrator, and those will be my quote-unquote blueprints, for the project. And then I'll just start building. And I'll use, any material that works, whether it's wood or cardboard, whatever will get the job done. That's my assistant. He doesn't, I don't have to pay him, but he's kind of short. So those are the windows. And this is the front of the building, one of the buildings in the construction phase. And then this is, the building the front after I've finished and painted it. And you can kind of see if I put the painting, after it, where, the things that I liked about painting, I'm still able to, to bring back, into this process. So even though I'm not actually, making paintings, I still get to paint. And, I really just like that part of working with my hands, and there's something that's really kind of therapeutic about it. And then, after I've, while I'm building the sets, I'm sort of casting, the project. And I really like choosing the models because it makes me feel very powerful. But it really is fun. And people ask me, where do I find the models? And Different places. A lot of them I find on a website, Model Mayhem, which is where you can find all kinds of models. There are thousands and thousands of models. The only problem is that sometimes the models, it can be hard to get in touch with models quickly over that website. But for this kind of project, I had plenty of time. And sometimes the models are friends of mine. The main male lead in this project was a trainer at my gym. I just liked the way he looked and his beard, and he was into it. So it worked out really well. And so after I've chosen the model, I'll start doing sort of these little rough photo references for the photo shoot. I'll, actually schedule a photo shoot with the model. And by this time, I have a pretty good idea, of what the composition is. And one thing I like is that the process is very flexible. So a lot of the images I'll have in mind ahead of time, but a lot of the poses will be improvised by the model too, and sometimes that leads to images that I hadn't even thought of. So you can see that, again, it's my wide range of paintings and photographs, and you can see in the middle there's a little shot of the, half-finished diorama with my little assistant in there. He helps me out a lot, and that's why he's very good at this, actually. And this is what I'll actually take, to the photo shoot. And I'll use these as reference when I'm posing the model. And the photo shoot is, it's really one of my favorite aspects of the project because it's, I guess by far the most social. So I'm actually working with other people. But in a way, it's also the most stressful because there's a limited, amount of time. I'm paying the models. I'm paying the stylist. I've rented the clothes. So that, in a way, it kind of adds to sort of the high, and the energy. But I'm also kind of glad that I don't do it every single day. That I do it. In fact, as I tell people, they say, how long did it take you to do the project? And I'll say, well, the actual photographs are probably about 2 or 3 weeks, but everything else is about 2 years, which is pretty accurate. So that's my leading lady, Zoe, and I found her on Model Mayhem, and she was absolutely marvelous to work with. And that's my hair and makeup stylist, Fallon, and I've worked with her on the Hoppers as well, and she's simply amazing. And Zoe had like this long, wavy hair. And I had told Fallon before that I wanted it, kind of up the way these women wore it in the 30s. And she said, oh, that's no problem, And it really wasn't. And she had braided, put in all these tiny braids and then tucked it up, into her hair. And you couldn't see it at all. So it was really this wonderful transformation. And so then I just take a lot of photographs against a plain backdrop. And the dress is actually a vintage dress that I rented. And I was very fortunate to find this place in the garment district that rents costumes. And the woman that works there is very knowledgeable about historical fashions, and so she was a very good guide, for me, in saying, "Oh no, that's 40s, not 30s," So, so I felt good about that. So I would take, I think I probably took 400 or 500 photographs of Zoe that day, and a few different, a couple different costume changes with different props and things. And that would last me about a year, I think. And then I had one more photo shoot about a year after that, with Zoe, to finish up the rest of those. And so this was the actual pose that became this. And this was the first image in the series. And the title of this one is called The Tailor's Wife. And I imagine this family as being in the, that the husband is a tailor, because that was a very common profession for Jews, well, for a long time, but especially back then in the 30s in Europe. And so this is called The Tailor's Wife. And I chose not to name the characters because I wanted to leave it open-ended. I didn't want people to have associations, I guess, with certain names and things like that. So I chose not to name the characters. But I made a decision that I wanted, the first few images to function, I guess, as what, we learned back in the English class is called the exposition, where you're just setting the stage for the story. So you're introducing the characters and the setting. And so this is the next image. Actually, there's one missing, but never mind. And I call this one Working Morning. And so this is really the current, the family at the beginning of the story as I see it. So we've got the husband who's the tailor, and then you've got his wife, and I think of the other woman as his mother. So it's her mother-in-law. And most people, I guess, unless you know a little bit about that culture and that history, you might not be able to tell much. But if you know a little bit, as I learned, you can tell from his dress that he's pretty religious and traditional. And you can tell by her dress and our mother-in-law's dress, because, first of all, because their elbows are showing, which a traditional, religious Jewish woman wouldn't allow her elbows, to be showing. And also they're wearing makeup, which is another thing that a religious Jewish woman, especially at that time, would not have done, most likely would not have done. So I wanted to suggest this sort of tension, in the family, but in a very subtle way. And also you can see on the right, you can't really tell, but that's a picture of one of the historical, Jewish rabbis who, So my thinking is that this guy is still very religious, but there's something going on because his mother and his wife have sort of strayed a little bit, but we don't really know why. The other thing that I wanted to mention is that the neighborhood that I placed the story in, Kazimierz, also is kind of a metaphor itself for loss and decay, in that it had once been a really vibrant cultural center, but by this time in the 1930s, it had really fallen kind of into a very kind of low point. And so that the only people that still lived there were considered very poor and ultra-religious. And so this sort of continues the exposition, and this is, their simple dinner. The challenging thing about doing this particular image was that I wanted to have, the food on the table, and I wanted it to blend with the miniature set, but I couldn't use mini food because it looked like, mini food. I wanted it to look like real food. So the only thing so the people are full size and the food is full size, but everything else is miniature, the table and the chairs and everything. So to get that to blend was for me kind of, was probably the most time-consuming, montage, in the series. Also, it was a bit tricky because for almost all of the images, except I think for this one, the main light is actually like an artificial, like a speed light or a strobe coming in off camera. But in this image, it's actually being the interior, except for the people, is actually being lit by that little dollhouse light that's actually functioning as a light. So that was a little tricky getting that to blend right. And because it's digital, there was some noise I had to deal with, so that was tricky. And this one again is, this one is very much absolutely based on this painting by Van Gogh, which is called The Potato Eaters. I gave it the same title, so I'm not like I'm acknowledging, the theft at least.
Can you go back to the previous slide?
Yeah.
I'm just noticing the wife's gesture, the way she holds her fork. I, it's right in the center. Is that intentional in some way, or?
Oh, it's so funny you asked that. You know, because this was like the last scene that I shot that day, and we ran really, really late because my usually punctual hairstylist was like an hour and a half late. So everybody was tired and cranky, and we were rushing, and I forgot to tell them how to hold the silverware. And and my wife, who is my my European advisor on this, she goes, "Oh, you blew it." They're not holding the silverware right. And so I did the best I could, but she's okay and he's okay. It's really Zoe that she should be holding it a little bit differently. So, but it's not. At least she's not like eating with her with her right hand, like that, because they would spear it with the left hand and go like that, cut it like this and spear it. So, good eye. Yeah. This is probably the happiest picture I've ever done. Probably the only happy picture I've ever done, and it's a flashback, really, and that's how I mean it to function in the story. In the story, the couple at one time had a son, and the son is no longer present. We assume he died. We don't know how. So this flashes back to a happier time. And so the title of this one I call this Once Upon a Time, which sort of plays on both the fact that he's reading a book, but it also is thinking of a happier time. And in this one, unlike the other ones, the wife, you can see, is dressed much more modestly. She has her hair covered and her elbows are covered. So at this point, she was traditional. Now, you wouldn't really know it probably unless I told you, but the idea for this photograph actually came from this photograph by Dwayne Michaels, who I've always been a big fan of Dwayne Michaels. And he, was kind of a pioneer in this sort of, stage storytelling work. And he would also, a lot of times add writing to it. So when you look at this, you just see this, this photograph of this happy couple. And you think, oh, what a nice, it's a nice happy couple. And then you read the little caption, and the caption says, "This photograph is my proof that there was that afternoon when things were still good between us, and she embraced me, and we were so happy. It did happen. She did love me. Look, see for yourself." So then it kind of transforms the way you see the photograph. So it really becomes about loss, and not about happiness per se. So this is, the next photograph, and this one I kind of wanted to, maybe this is a little heavy-handed, but I wanted to get across the idea that they were grieving, for this son. So I have the photograph of the son in the background, and then there's a tear, coming from her eye. And the title of this one is called Shachris, and Shachris is the Hebrew word for morning prayers in the in Hebrew ritual. If you're an Orthodox Jew, you're required to pray 3 times a day: morning, afternoon, and evening. And the morning is called Shachris. And so, in this, my thinking in this image is that he's kind of dealing with his grief, by in religion and tradition. And for her, it just kind of isn't working, and so she's kind of gone away from that. And so she's kind of crying against the bed, and this picture of the son is on the floor. And so it kind of illustrates the sort of schism, in the marriage. This one I like to think of as sort of a dream image. Where he sort of returns to visit his mother in a dream, and because that's kind of she kind of can't she thinks about him all day, she dreams about him at night, and I don't actually have it, but I actually made a family photograph. You can see it on the wall in the background I think it's on my website. But and it's actually in the if you get a chance to go to the exhibition at Klam Ching, it's actually framed there. And a lot of people thought it was actually my family, but it's the actors, dressed up. So it was a prop for this. Okay, so and this is one of the images that I did really that I wanted to try to kind of push the story along in terms of the narrative. And so I'm kind of introducing this sort of this kind of dark character, played by me, who is a customer of the Tailors. And the idea is that he's being, measured for, pants or whatever. And the title of it is called Measuring. But the idea is that he's sort of, he's eyeing the wife who's working at the table. And then, so he's sort of measuring her. And then there's sort of this image of the rabbi, old rabbi, is kind of, watching down at her as well. So she's kind of stuck, in the middle. And this particular image, whenever I kind of, in the images that I have this sort of dark character in, who I kind of wanted to sort of embody kind of, evil or this coming menace, whatever, I used, I tried a lot to look at sort of film noir images. I never got it quite as shadowy as I was hoping to, but I got the idea across. And I also changed the lens in my camera to a wide-angle lens so that the space I want is a little bit more distorted. And so you'll see in all these images with him in it, the space is, it's a much wider angle lens. And so the idea is that she begins this sort of, or maybe it's, a one-time thing, this illicit affair, in her grief or whatever, she kind of exhibits this sort of self-destructive behavior. But I wanted to have sort of show her little, journey, and along the way, I wanted to have some kind of little street scene, in the neighborhood. So this, say, is maybe not quite where she lives, but it's another neighboring street where she's not quite as well known. So the little girl is kind of eyeing her, as she's going into the apartment building. And these are just kind of two local guys, and, kind of posing for the camera. And then this older guy watching the little girl. That's me, actually, too, by the way. I play that guy. And this was one of the more difficult ones to, for me to get it to blend, to get the figures to blend in the scene, because the lighting in this is a little bit different. In most of the other ones, the lighting is more direct. It's fairly hard lighting. In this one, it's almost like a cloudy day. The lighting is very diffuse, and I found it much more of a challenge to actually blend the figures in this one. Okay, so then she enters the apartment building, and this one I call ascending, because she's ascending the stairs. And then you can see also the little girl has followed her in, and she's just kind of curious by this, what's this woman doing here? And so she's going up to this guy's apartment. And the title, Ascending, in one sense I think it seems kind of counterintuitive, because in a way she's really kind of lowering herself, going down into a kind of a dark place. But I kind of like that it was a little bit counterintuitive. And then I just learned something, this past week that I didn't know, that made it, gave it another layer for me. That in ancient Jewish ritual, when, 2,000 years ago, when there was a temple, and all the Jews went to this one temple in Jerusalem to pray, and they would make animal sacrifices at the temple. And there was a sacrifice that was called the burnt offering, where an animal would be entirely burned, on the altar. And the idea was that it was complete submission to God, because the animal would be completely incinerated, and all the smoke would go up to God. And that offering was called the olah. And a lot of people think that ola means burnt offering, but what it actually means is ascension, because the smoke is going up to God. And that was just very weird when I learned that. I didn't know that when I titled it. But I was actually very, this was one of the more difficult dioramas with the stairway. I was very proud of that. And this image is actually not in the exhibition. This is another one that I kind of did just to sort of push the narrative along. And this was another one that was really inspired by film noir. And I wanted to kind of make sure you knew that who the guy was, I suppose. Maybe it's a little heavy-handed, but. And then this one, which is kind of, her, afterwards. And, she feels, just kind of as low as a person can possibly feel. And I remember when I was photographing Zoe for this, I told her, what I wanted to portray. And I had her lit, this light in a certain way. And I thought, oh, that's perfect. And I took the picture. And then, of course, the great thing about digital photography is that it's instant gratification. You can see exactly, what you get right away. And so I thought, oh, that's perfect. And then I looked at the photograph, and it looked exactly like the opposite of what I want. It looked like, oh, that was great, So, so we had to keep working, and eventually we got there, So this one was, definitely inspired by photographs by Bill Brandt, who was a German-born photographer who worked mostly in Britain around World War II. And so I was really inspired by both of these photographs. It's almost a combination of the two. So he used this very wide-angle lens too, and this really, up-close image of the silhouette of the woman. So that's what that's what inspired that image. And so then, this image was about sort of, I suppose, the dissolution, I say, of the relationship. And you can see there's somebody, maybe the mother-in-law, in the window up above. And the interesting thing is that some people tell me that they think that the husband is kicking her out, but in my mind, the husband actually, would forgive her, but it's like she can't forgive herself, and so that's why, it's more her choice to leave than that he's kicking her out.
What's the poster?
The poster, I'll show you more. That's actually, there are more posters in the next image. That was another fun part, was finding these old Yiddish posters online that might have been on the buildings then. Yiddish was the language that European Jews used until there were no more European Jews. And some of the Orthodox Jews, in America still speak it. It's a form of, I guess, mostly Old German mixed with a little bit of Hebrew, and the characters, though, are all Hebrew characters. So those are old, Yiddish and sometimes Yiddish and Polish posters, because, of course, they spoke Polish, too. So a lot of times the posters were in both languages. But I think the poster with the face on it is a theater poster. There was a lot of Yiddish theater in Krakow. Krakow's always been a cultural center, even then. So this is another one, and this one I call the intervention. And so you can see there are more posters there that are both in Polish and in Yiddish. And I like to think of this one as the mother trying to convince, this is just me, and I don't want to spoil anybody else's thoughts, In my mind, she's trying to convince the wife not to leave, I like to think of that there's a bond between these two women, even though they don't share blood. I like that idea. But I left it kind of open-ended, so. And there's the husband who feels somewhat powerless, still in the background. I would also add, that probably the single longest element that took to make was the cobblestone street, because I actually had to make all the cobblestones. So.
What do you make them of?
I made them out of foam core, actually. These little pieces of foam core that I would cut and then crush with my fingers at night watching television. This isn't my image, actually. Okay, this is a famous painting by the Italian surrealist Giorgio de Chirico, and I always loved this image. And I think I knew, not long after I started the project, that I wanted to kind of take a crack, at this image, and that it would be the last image, in the series. And I confess I still like his painting better than my image, but I still love his painting. So this is the image that was based on his painting. And I gave it the same title. I love the title, too, The Mystery and Melancholy of a Street. It's so poetic. And so in this image, there's this kind of surreal, almost like a dreamy landscape. And the boy is sort of walking or running down this street, and there's a shadow coming. And so I think of this as very much as sort of a dream or otherworldly image. And again, I can't kind of help myself from making up stories about it. And I see him as sort of running towards there's a shadow coming, and I think of it as his mother, and this kind of otherworldly or spiritual reunion with his mother. That's kind of how I think of it. But again, it's very dreamy, and I tried to kind of mimic the sense of distortion, from the surrealist painting, and that the buildings are shot kind of with two different angle lenses. So the building on the left is more of a wide angle lens than the one on the right, to kind of help kind of bend the space a little bit. And that is how the story ends. Thank you.
When you're compositing your photographs with the dioramas, how do you get the scale of the photographic elements to fit into the scale of the diorama? Is there some formula, or is that just judgment?
Judgment. There's no formula. In fact, I always worry that somebody's going to figure out that the scale doesn't match from, how come he's taller on this one than that one, And I try to keep it consistent, but I basically, I just do it by eye and what feels right. And sometimes I was just working on one the other day, and I worked on it for a couple hours, left for about an hour, came back, and I'm like, oh, he's too big, so. It's more judgment.
So I kind of have a follow-up question to that in terms of the scale of lighting. So I recently actually worked on a project with small paper things, and I realized very quickly that even the biggest, softest lights would end up casting very hard shadows and totally kind of distort the classic ideas that I understood of how light should work. Is that hard to put together that way?
That's so fun. Somebody just asked me that. You didn't email me, did you?
No.
Okay. No, I just use whatever modifiers I need. I mean, a lot of times I'll have to aim the light, so I'll use I found that for the dioramas I use mostly speed lights. So I'll either have a grid that I'll attach to the light, or I'll make a snoot out of either a modifier or cinefoil. And so I can get a really pretty good pinpoint. And then if I want it soft, I have a small space, and I'll usually, sometimes I'll use an umbrella, but a lot of times I'll just bounce it off a ceiling or a wall.
Do you find yourself using also those tiny little, you mentioned using a model light in one of them, like the actual?
I don't, because the problem is that I can't get enough light out of them. Even for where is this? This one, a lot of the light is coming from the overhead, but what I did was I found this little kind of plastic half globe almost. So I used that as a fixture, and then I cut a hole in the ceiling and put a speed light on top and triggered it, that way. But the problem I found with the model lights was that I couldn't get enough light, so that I ended up having to use, too wide an aperture, and then and I didn't have enough, depth of field. So.
Hi, sir. Thanks for coming to this lecture. I really love your work. And before my question, I would like to say, so Hopper and Kitiko, they're my favorite artists. So the first painting that for the Hopper is a Room by the Sea. The other Hopper's painting.
I didn't understand the question. Sir.
My favorite Edward Hopper painting that the first time see his work is the Room by the Sea.
Ah, okay. Yeah. Yeah, I didn't do that one.
Oh, yeah, I mean, so my question is, so I have two questions. The first question is, how do you balance the sharpness, because it's compositing? But when you do the miniature shot and you do the people, so I can see sometimes really hard to control the sharpness and the depth of field.
Yeah. Well, especially when I did the hoppers, a lot of them have a very shallow depth of field. So I often had to blur the figure or part of the figure to get it to match. I mean, I know that there's this really a common desire to have like this super, super sharp images. Fortunately, I don't have that hang up. So to me, it's more important that things are balanced. So you can get away with something being not razor sharp if it's next to something that's not as sharp as it. So usually almost every time when I put the figure in, the figure's too sharp. So I'll have to soften the figure almost invariably to match the background, to match the miniatures. And in a way, I almost don't want the set to be super, super sharp, because then every little flaw, shows up in it. So it's kind of a balancing act, in terms of what you can get away with and what you can't, in terms of being miniature, And some things you think are going to work and they don't work, and other things you're surprised that they work as well as they do. So, I mean, I was surprised that when I did the hoppers that there were people that didn't know that they were miniatures. I thought for sure you would know right away, but a lot of people don't.
My second question is, I'm kind of curious because you talk about the Once Upon this project. So I'm curious because I really love Hopper's work. So my question is, why give the title is meditation to the Hopper's work?
Why give the title Hopper Meditation? Because it was sort of my meditations on Hopper, I suppose. And they're very quiet. They're very, I think of them as very meditative. I tend to be very meditative, so it seemed like, what I love about Hopper's paintings is sort of the stillness in them. And not just the stillness, but the kind of the drama that he's able to find in the stillness, And somehow I like the title, Hopper Meditations,
You had a very successful Kickstarter action, and I'm sure people would be interested to know how you did it, what it entailed, and what do you think about that now?
Yeah, I did a Kickstarter campaign to fund in terms of preparing for the exhibition. And I was really nervous at first because I had some friends that had successful Kickstarter campaigns. And I had 3 friends that had successful campaigns, and 2 of them said, it's too much work, don't even bother, it's just so much work. And then the 3rd friend said, it's a lot of work, but you should do it, And I'm really glad I did it. It was really, I'm grateful it was successful. But it was really, really fun for me to do it. It was a great experience. And I do think that it's important that if you're going to do a Kickstarter, that you have a pretty good presence on social media, because that was by far and away how most of my funds were raised. One of my friends, actually, is my cousin, who ran a successful Kickstarter, and he didn't have a big social media presence, and he was able to do it successfully because he had so many other connections, people that did have a presence, and he did fundraisers. He really worked his tail off. For me, it was mostly social media, but also family and friends. A lot. I was really generous contributions from family and friends, from people that I knew. Maybe 30 or 40% of the contributions, maybe 30% were from people that I knew. And it is a lot of work, but I think you have to be careful. I was very lucky because my gallerist, Darren Ching, who's in the back, was very helpful to me in terms of designing rewards for it. I don't think it would have been nearly as successful if I hadn't had Darren's input in that. So I think it's important to do it in a very mindful way, and talk to as many people as you can before you jump into it if you're going to do it. But I'm really thrilled with how it worked out, and it was a fair amount of work doing the fulfillment and getting all the rewards out. But it wasn't that bad, Yes.
I'm curious about the personal and very site-specific story about Poland. It's not really commercial.
No, I'm finding that out, yes.
So where do you think, just from your own philosophy, this was a personal story, do you think it has any commercial value? Now today, in today's world, it appears to me that it is very timely. How do you think this can get out into the world?
The question is, this project, Kazimierz, seems to be a very personal project and not very commercially minded. How do you think it can get out into the world, given that sensibility? Is that correct?
It is correct.
Okay.
And the fact that we're at a time in the political world right now, it seems timely to me because of prejudice, of all kinds of survival.
Yeah, no, I think it is timely, but I think the themes really are timeless. I mean, first of all, it's important to. I think as an artist, you have limited choices in terms of what you're going to. You have to do something that you feel strongly about. Because I think every artist's kind of goal is to make an emotional connection with the viewer. At least that's my goal. And so in order to do that, you have to do something that you feel emotionally connected to. So this was a story that I wanted to tell, and I didn't, even though I think, obviously, if you have an origin that's similar to what the content of the story, that is one way into it. But I did want, I didn't want to limit it, to that. So I tried to choose themes that I thought are universal, such as, love and loss, and grief. And that's what I hope will speak to people, In terms of, I guess I don't, I want to make things that are, beautiful still, and hopefully that will find a way, I can understand why, it's not, something that everyone might want over their couch, but I see it still, to me, I still get comfort, from looking at some of these types of images, and that's kind of what I'm hoping for.
They have an edge to them. They're wonderful.
Thank you.
Magnificent. I mean, just absolutely magnificent, so that without the story part, I think that they have their own strength. Each image has its own strength.
Well, that was my hope.
Thank you. Yeah, no, that's good.
And I think, honestly, some of the images I did almost as vehicles push the narrative along. So they might be a little, I can see where they would be a little more difficult to read, you know, if you didn't know the rest of the story. But I never really made an image that I thought couldn't stand on its own, you know.
Thank you.
Okay.
One more question.
So, in respect to your dioramas and your props, I would assume that they're very sensitive and fragile. Was there ever a time that either something broke, and if so, did you incorporate that into something? Did you keep like a break, or did you just go back and fix it so it was back to normal?
Oh, the question is, these things are fragile. The little diorama and the prop things are fragile. Do they break? And if they break, do I repair them, or do I kind of let it be a happy accident? Is that so? Yeah. Well, they are fragile, and I can get very frustrated at times, you know, when things break. As you know, a lot of times it's not a pretty process because I'm very into it, and you know, my wife will tell you that I can get very frustrated, you know, with it. That's a good question. I think that happens more. I'm able to, I think, to hold things together enough, you know. They only have to stay together long enough for me to take the photograph. So I'm usually able to do that. I think the accidents almost happen more when I'm painting things, you know, and they don't turn out the way I thought they were going to turn out. Or even when I was doing the cobblestones, I wasn't sure how they were going to turn out. I'd never done it before. So I kind of just go with it and see what happens when I photograph it. It's almost like it's hard to tell sometimes until you actually photograph it, what it's going to look like. And the lighting changes everything too. And a lot of times I'll spend time, you know, on one little detail of this window, and then it doesn't even show, you know, in the final photograph. So you just never know. But I try to think of it all. It's all part of the process. I don't know if that answers the question, but.
You mentioned that when you're working on a project, in the back of your mind, you are looking ahead at the next project. Do you want to give us a teaser, like a world preview here?
Oh, yeah. Well, I'll say that I haven't started it yet, but I do have a project in the back of my mind. And one thing that I found is that as I've gotten older, my work has tended to become more and more personal, you know. And so the next project is probably even more personal. So I'll say that about it.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
God bless.